at what an MPPG is and how that fits within AAPM. So this is going to specifically be talking about MPPG number 10, which may or may not mean anything to you, because it wouldn't have meant anything to me a year and a half or so ago either. Maybe a little longer. But, so this is the most recently published practice guideline within AAPM. I put a link to, it was published in the November issue of JACMP. So if you, I don't know, want something to read at some point or look through it, I'm going to have parts of it up here, but I want to discuss more sort of generally what's in it. And I put a link on there too, which is probably not terribly useful to where to jump on it. Okay, so medical physics practice guidelines. This was something that was implemented within AAPM in 2011. It's part of professional council. And the idea is that it's more clinically focused than a task group report. So I think that most people are probably familiar with the AAPM task group reports. And I think the idea was really saying, how do we have something that's really like, not, sometimes it may be a how-to guide, how do I implement this in my practice, but really something that's more clinically focused, can be put out a little bit more quickly. I know that there's some task groups that actually are still in existence, that have been in existence for over 10 years. Which, you know, is not ideal, but the idea is that these MPPGs might be a little bit shorter, not contain as much of the basic science necessarily, but really be a tool for clinical physicists to be able to use. Freely accessible to the general public. And the other thing that makes them different than task group reports is there's a sunset date of no more than 5 years from publication. So we all know that clinical practice changes fairly rapidly, and so the idea is that these MPPGs have to be reviewed at least every 5 years. Whereas my understanding is that task groups live on whatever. So these should be being reviewed and updated as necessary. So this is kind of a flowchart. I didn't know Mike was going to add something in there. So, you know, Education Council is, I don't know if there's a pointer in here, is over there with all the stuff he talked about. Professional Council, again, we go through this long list of subcommittees. So there's clinical practice subcommittee, subcommittee on practice guidelines, and that's where the MPPGs live. Now, the task group reports are under Science Council, so they're sort of in their own different branch of AAPM, and one thing, of course, is making sure that one group's talking to the other and know what's going on. So this is a list of everything, all of the medical physics practice guidelines that have been published, and with number 10 being the most recent, number 11 is currently in review. And one thing that's come up is how does an idea, how do we determine what becomes a medical physics practice guideline? And this was a conversation that came up at the annual meeting actually this last year, and I was talking about it with Jen Stickle a little bit earlier this evening, because that's sort of been done, I don't want to say behind closed doors, but there hasn't really been an official process for how that happens. So if you, as an AAPM member, say, hey, it would be really useful to have AAPM work on an MPPG for this particular topic, how do you make that happen? And the response that ultimately I got from people on those committees and from Bruce Madsen, who's the current AAPM president, he's like, yeah, we don't actually really have a good mechanism for doing that. So that's one thing that they're currently working on. I don't think that that's done yet. But the idea is to have a more formal mechanism so that going forward, people can say, hey, I've got this idea, and whether it's for an MPPG or a task group or whatever, that there's some way to route that so it finds a home. But you can see that there are a variety of things that have been addressed. So the first one, CT protocol management and review of the practice guidelines. That was the first one. There's some QA commissioning things I'm going to say, full disclosure. For those of you who don't know, I'm an imaging person, so I don't really know, I'm not familiar with the content of the therapy-related stuff. But there's a variety of stuff. The first ones who have, so this first one has already hit its sunset period, so they've sort of tried to reform the band, so to speak. And that's one challenge that they have now come into. They're like, hey, wait a minute, we said we'd review these every 5 years. But does that mean that it's the same committee of people that's reviewing it? Do we get together a new committee? What if those people who originally wrote it aren't willing to do it anymore, they're retired? So there's some of those practical challenges too that my understanding is, I'm not sure that they've really hit thought through might come up, some issues that might come up. So ideally, that would have been done by the end of 2018 and revised and everything. That hasn't happened, but they have kind of put that group back together to make the appropriate revisions. I don't remember exactly where it stands. But like I said, you can kind of look through this. Some of you, number 8, I think has been the most controversial. This idea of medical physics extenders, which I think is a kind of a strange terminology, but what they came up with it. But whether it's physics techs, medical physicist assistants, whatever. Number 8, I put the TBD there because there's been a huge amount of controversy about this. And people couldn't really agree on what the recommendation should be. And so that's still a work, that still hasn't been finalized. Kind of in line with that, though, is number 10. So those two, they said, hey, these are kind of linked. So let's come up with a scope of practice document for clinical medical physics. And the idea was, there were multiple parts to it. Maybe not? Oh, there we go. So APM is getting a lot of requests from other organizations about a scope of practice document. A lot of other organizations, most professional organizations, nursing, physician groups, PAs, whatever, they have scope of practice documents. And so regulatory agencies go to those professional organizations and they look to that for guidance when they're developing regulations, or accreditation bodies will do the same sort of thing. And so APM is getting a lot of requests and they're like, hey, we don't have anything. And so I think the idea partly was we want to be the ones who are defining this rather than letting some other external group come in and define for us what this scope of practice is. There was a much shorter professional policy that talked a little bit about scope of practice, so this replaces that, and the idea was for it to be something that's a little bit more comprehensive. The task group was created in 2016, chaired by Jessica Clemens. And these are all of the committee members that were on this task, they call it a task group, but it's not a task group report. It's very confusing to me. For this MTBG, I don't know. So I apologize if I use them interchangeably because I guess I'm a little bit unsure always what category the group itself falls into. Anyway, one thing that I think was interesting is that 60% of the task group members or committee members were MS physicists. And I think this is important because I think a lot of the time clinical practice is, of course, there are a lot of MS physicists doing very good clinical work, but I think that there's a tendency to kind of weight some of these committees by academic physicists and by PhD physicists. And so I think that, I don't actually know if this was done intentionally, but I'm glad that it's the way that it turned out. So I've kind of indicated here where people's different specialties are, different people on the committee. Of course, there are a bunch of therapy folks doing stuff that I don't fully understand. 22% have some, are either dual boarded in nuke med, or only do, I guess all of them are dual boarded in nuke med and imaging. But again, trying to get some representation, there are not a lot of nuke med physicists, but trying to get some representation from that group as well. So I think there really was some diversity that went into this. So here's kind of a timeline. The task group was created and approved by APM. We started writing in November of 2016. It went out for member review, so I don't know if any of you have made comments or not, but it went out for member review in June of 2017. The other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that all of the APM comments have to be addressed. Oops. So that what happens is the task group, or whether it's a TG report or an MPPG, when that goes out for comment, and you guys should all get emails saying, hey, this is out for review, read through it, make your comments if you want. All of those we have to address. We have to demonstrate to APM that each of those has been discussed within the committee and addressed in some way. A lot of the time, we'll go back to the original commenter and say, hey, does this kind of satisfy, if we make this change, does this kind of address what your concern was? Anyway, August of 2017, it was approved by the APM Board of Directors, submitted to JCMP, and it took more than a year for that to be published in JCMP. And part of the reason is we had gotten comments back from APM membership, went to the Board of Directors. I say we, it really wasn't me, but the royal we, I guess. APM Board of Directors voted, said, hey, great, we approve of this. Well, it goes out for review for JACMP. Well, that goes through its own peer review process. So now JACMP reviewers are like, hey, we want to make, we have all these comments and suggested changes and everything, but after we address those, it's changed significantly enough that then we felt like we had to go back to AAPM and say, hey, can you guys take a look at this again? So there's this sort of, and that's something else that AAPM is addressing, is that when you have these task group reports or the MPPGs, it kind of has to go through two review processes, one through AAPM and one through the journal itself. And in the past, that really hasn't been, my understanding is that there hasn't really been terribly well coordinated. So that's something else that they're working on, is how can we streamline that process so it doesn't take over a year for that to take place. Okay. So, the document itself. So the first thing that it states in here is it's not a regulatory document. It will be affected by changes in technology and healthcare practices, and that's acknowledged. So it's kind of, I don't want to say a living document, but the understanding is that this will likely change over time based on how clinical practice changes. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list, and the idea is that any incorporation by other groups must be by reference. So this was something that was a big, there were people kind of on both sides of the table, so to speak, because if in initial drafts it said there was that APM was encouraging that regulatory bodies adopt this, what's outlined in terms of saying what medical physicists are sort of qualified to do and what work should be done only by an APM-defined qualified medical physicist. And then there was the other side of things that said, hey, you know, if we are actively encouraging what these regulatory bodies are going to do, is that really the stance that we want to take? And so what it says right now is that if regulatory, it says in the document, if it's adopted by regulatory agencies, the idea is that they reference this document itself instead of picking bits and pieces out of it. Partly because we know that this document is probably going to have to be changed over time to adapt to practices. So they use must and must not. Adherence to the recommendation is considered necessary to conform to the practice guidance. Should and should not indicates a prudent practice to which exceptions may occasionally be made. That's just the terminology, and I wanted to put that up there. So it's kind of the difference between should and shall. There is a surprisingly large amount of conversation about discussion about whether using must, should, shall, whatever. So the scope of practice document defines 4 major practice areas. So radiation oncology, nuke med, diagnostic imaging, and MRI. And part of this was decided upon because that's sort of how board certifications are broken up, and that's kind of how practice is broken up, recognizing that there are a lot of people who, MR scientists, who do MR who are certified through ABMS, what's the acronym that I'm not thinking of?
ABMP.
ABMP, thank you. Board certified through ABMP, and so kind of pulling that up. Now you could say, well, we could divide it up even more. We could pull out ultrasound. We could pull out, you know, whether it's brachytherapy, proton therapy, and things like that. But at some point, we kind of had to come up with hopefully a happy medium. Recognizing that there are also aspects of medical physics clinical medical physics, where all of these things overlap. So if you think about things like PAC systems, or even patient dosimetry, or, I mean, there's some things that are common to all 4 of those areas. And then there are other areas where, again, there's a lot of crossover between how do you say this falls under the domain of diagnostic imaging physicists, but really not an MR physicist. I mean, there's so much crossover, and that's sometimes difficult to weed out. So the first thing is it goes through and it discusses what is a qualified medical physicist. APM has their, I'm struggling with my acronyms.
Professional policy.
Professional policy, thank you. Professional policy number 1 defines what a qualified medical physicist is. So they mention competent to practice independently. Well, that's probably a good thing. Has an advanced degree in an appropriate field. These are this is, of course, paraphrased. Is board certified. And they also mention that states and modalities may have additional requirements. So Mike mentioned additional training requirements and continuing education requirements for mammography. Also, states may have requirements that are more strict. But this is kind of the general idea. So what is the responsibility of a QMP? So we're talking about scope of practice, what clinical activities really should be done by a qualified medical physicist, which APM and already defined, what are their responsibilities? Ultimately, it's to perform or oversee the scientific and technical aspects of procedures necessary to assure the safe and effective use of radiation in medicine. And of course, we struggled over the radiation in medicine. Well, then are we leaving out MR and ultrasound? We're like, okay, well, we're just going to call it radiation, even though we're recognizing that it's non-ionizing radiation in those cases. There's a lot of debate about that, and what you'll see through a lot of this, and one thing I want to emphasize, is the final document is, in many ways, sort of a compromise. I don't think it's necessarily perfect. It is not it's not representative of any one person's view on these things, but there are a lot of conversations that surrounded this, and a lot of, okay, if we have to, if we're putting something down on paper, what is the best, most helpful, most reasonable thing to do? So that's where we ended up anyway. Okay, so QMP roles. So the other thing is, we have to sit down and it's like, okay, well, what does a QMP do? During the course of clinical practice, if you then think about an academic physicist, a consulting physicist, in all of these different subspecialties in different work environments, what do they actually spend their time doing? So, because if we want to define what work should be done by a physicist, we have to figure out what it is that they do. And there's a lot of diversity. And so we tried to kind of putting these things in different buckets can be challenging. And I'm not sure that the final result is the best result, but it was broken down into administrative services, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, clinical services, education, informatics, and equipment performance evaluation. So again, you may say, hey, there's some things that I can think of that I do in my day-to-day job that fall into multiple categories or don't really fit into any of those, and that's absolutely true. But again, this was sort of an attempt at how do we kind of tackle this? Because if you think, hey, we've been tasked with making a list of everything that AAPM, that this group thinks that should be done by a QMP, that's kind of a daunting task because there's so many things that we do. Oh, see, I forgot one. Quality. That's probably important to have up there too, huh? Okay. See, I forgot another one. Oh man, this is bad. Okay, quality and safety. Are there any others that I forget? Oh, no. So, but one thing that is a recurring theme is performing or overseeing scientific and technical aspects of this. So the other thing, a lot of the time, and this is where it comes back to tying in with this idea of medical physics extenders, which sounds like some sort of contraption that you'd see on late night TV for sale. But assistants, people who don't meet the definition of QMP, who may be going out and doing some of the work. And I think that everybody recognizes that there is a role for that, but the question, of course, comes up, and part of why this MPPG 8 still isn't published is because there's so much disagreement. What is appropriate for those people? That sounds really bad. What is appropriate for a medical physicist assistant to be doing in the clinic versus a QMP? And really what it comes back to again though, is that the QMP is ultimately responsible for anything that medical physicist assistant is doing. Okay. So other definitions it goes through. So we tried to break this up into different breaking these into different categories. And we said, okay, well, what involvement should there be from a QMP? What activities have to be done by a QMP? Which things can be performed or supervised by a QMP? And which activities should include a QMP? You think of like a radiation safety committee or something like that. You should have a QMP who's involved in that, but it doesn't need to be run by, they don't have to be the one who's ultimately responsible for that. But a lot of these things, it's like, hey, it would be nice to include a QMP in this discussion, but they don't have to be the only one doing that work. So it also goes back to levels of supervision, which again, APM has a professional policy for. Personal, direct, and general. Personal supervision is that you are right there with the person in the room while they're doing whatever it is they're doing. Direct is that you are immediately available. You're supposed to be in the general vicinity, on campus, around, so that if there's a problem, somebody can contact you and you can help them. General is you may have somebody who's saying, you say, okay, you know, you may meet with them once a week. They may be going out and testing x-ray systems or something like that, and you're looking over their reports, and you're looking over that final product, but you really don't, they're doing the work more or less independently, but you're reviewing it, and again, you're ultimately responsible for what that person's doing. Okay, so this was sort of a first iteration, because again, how do you make this visually appealing? Now we've got this massive amount of data, we're trying to figure out which of these buckets these different clinical tasks fall into, and this was sort of a first go at it, and not what was sort of the final product, but we made a whole list of clinical tasks and things that people did as part of their medical physicist work, and then tried to say, okay, does this apply to therapy, diagnostic, nuke med, or MR, and which of these categories does it fall into? And this was a daunting task, and there were many, many, many conversations about it, including this next part is, okay, well now we figured out kind of how we define what people are doing. Then the question is, okay, which of these do we feel has to be done by a QMP or should be done by a QMP, and which of them can be delegated? And if they can be delegated, what level of supervision is appropriate? There were hours and hours and hours of conversation about this because there are a lot of different opinions about how to do this. So this is kind of what we started out with, is dividing it up into these categories. Is additional specific training required? Is a QMP required for accreditation? Is there something addressed in the regulation or legislation? So this is kind of what the thought process. And this is what we ended up with. So the first 4 pages of the scope of practice document is text. It's an introduction. It kind of goes through some of the definitions that I already went through. So I already summarized it for you. You're welcome. But the last, I think, 11 pages is big, long tables. And I should back up. So part of the scope of practice, of course, was to help individual physicists kind of say, okay, well maybe this is kind of appropriate for something I need to be doing myself rather than delegating it. The other point was, of course, for regulatory and accreditation agencies to kind of give them some input on what AAPM's stance was on who should be doing those things, and especially on the imaging side of things, there are more and more regulations that are coming out about who has to do equipment testing, who has to do patient dosimetry sorts of things, and so that was part of it. The other discussion is, well, do we want to be able to have something that a physicist could take to a hospital administrator and say, look, you can't hire, I mean, this is something that our professional organization is recommending, that you have a QMP, somebody who meets these criteria, doing this work rather than hiring, I don't know, there's no way to say this without sounding snotty about it, hiring people who don't have the same training and background and experience or whatever. And so that was the other side of it. Okay, so anyway, back to this appendix, which is the vast majority of the document itself. So this first block lists out some administrative tasks, may be applicable to all subspecialties. It has a description of practice, and then it tries to put something into one of these categories. Activity must be performed by a QMP. Activity must be performed or supervised by a QMP. And the activity should include a PQMP, because this is kind of where we landed. And then on the right side, it has existing standards or guidelines, so there are a lot of references. So if there's another task group report, if there's a regulation, an FDA document, whatever it may be, that helped guide this, then that's included as a reference as well. Okay, so we can see here for some of the I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to kind of point some things out. So participates in operations management, for example, establish client expectations, allocate personnel, ensure expectations are met. So you'll see as you go through here though, and again, the second one here is participates in staffing and budget discussions. So you may not think of this as really, for me, I had never thought of this as part of this is not part of what I do in my day-to-day practice, but a lot of people do. And so I was kind of surprised by how involved, I don't know if this is more common for the therapy physicists than for the diagnostic folks, or if I'm just naive and sheltered, I don't know. But those are the sorts of things that are spelled out. Now you may go through here and say, well, hey, there's stuff missing, or stuff that I do that doesn't really fit into one of these categories, and that's probably true. But this is kind of how it's set up. So there's informatics tasks, participates in informatics technology resource management. Again, this is something that probably, regardless of subspecialty, that most medical physicists are doing to some degree. I'm not a big fan of being part of. I'm fortunate enough to work in a section at a hospital that has somebody else who's very interested in informatics, so that I don't have to do it. So I kind of try to deny that I have any knowledge of any of this, which I really don't have that much knowledge. But again, this is something that's common to a lot of different subspecialties. Okay, so again, ensures that all local and national regulations and accreditation requirements as relating to medical physics are met and maintained. This is a big chunk of stuff. But really, and again, it's who is ultimately responsible, who should be doing this. And this is something where the decision was made that this is kind of the most appropriate category for it to fall into. Now you could argue that you can have that supervised by a QMP. Maybe you have a health physicist or somebody who's helping do that. So certainly there were a lot of discussions, and it wasn't. Some of it was clearer than others which of these categories it should fall into. Some of it was, but you can't. I don't know. You say, well, it could fall into this category with all of these caveats. I mean, kind of it was. We had to make an ultimate decision at some point. Okay, oversees quality assurance and quality control programs to meet local and national regulations, accreditation standards, and something else I left off that I obviously don't remember because my memory's horrible. So again, the idea is not that the medical physicist, the QMP, is doing all of these things necessarily themselves, but they're overseeing it. They're ultimately responsible for it. Ensures training and competency requirements and monitors maintenance of competencies for clinical medical physics tasks. Again, the idea is that if you are hiring, if you have medical physics extenders, medical physics assistants, whatever, there really should be a QMP who's defining who's qualified to be in that role and who's doing that work and overseeing what they're doing. Same thing for other people that you make work with in the hospital. If there's nursing staff, technologists, whatever, acting in certain roles, there should be some, obviously there are things that are outside our scope of practice that they're doing, but if they're working in medical physics for diagnostic imaging, a lot of the time it's the technologists who are doing some of that daily, weekly, annual QA work, but really that should be managed by a QMP. Okay, for activities that require supervision by a QMP, identifies educational background and competencies required to perform those duties. That's kind of what I was talking about. Okay, so this is kind of where we got into more discussion. So again, it goes into clinical service tasks. There are things that are fairly general. The first one is kind of a catch-all, like for developing procedures and overseeing how things should be done overall. But then we get into ensures that measurement equipment is calibrated according to manufacturer recommendations. Well, yeah, somebody's got to be doing that, but who's ultimately responsible? That was a little bit less controversial. Reviews service activities and determines if more medical physics follow-up is needed. Again, there was a lot of discussion. Where we came into, and develops and oversees processes to authorize release of clinical equipment after service. So this again was something like, if you have it again, and I apologize for the therapy folks because I'm ignorant in many aspects of clinical physics and therapy, but if, for example, you have a CT scanner that has a tube replacement or some other sort of repair, who is the one who's going to decide, hey, that needs to be tested before it's used again on patients? It doesn't need to be tested based on what repair was done or anything like that. And so, whose role is that? Who is an appropriate person to be making those decisions? Again, things that are a little bit controversial, communicates with and educates patients, including discussions of risk, talking to other healthcare professionals about radiation dose and associated risks. And it may seem kind of stupid to say, why do we need to spell this out? But I think there were people on the committee who felt fairly strongly that you want to have these patient interactions, some of these patient interactions should be done by somebody who has some knowledge in that area. Folks from other institutions who were very concerned about this. Same thing, radiation dose estimates from diagnostic and nuclear medicine exams, peak skin dose estimates, things like that. Things where really there should be a QMP involved and somebody who is a specialist in this area. And this brings up another point. So there was, several years ago, after I joined the physics group at University of Colorado, shortly after I joined, hopefully unrelated, but I don't know, our nuclear medicine physicist left. And one of the clinical services that he had been supporting was maximum tolerable dose estimates for treatment of patients who had usually it was patients who had had their thyroid removed. And so there's individual patient dosimetry that takes place. They do a nuclear medicine exam, and the idea is that then you communicate with the endocrinologist and say, okay, this is the maximum amount of iodine that you can use to treat this patient that's not likely to cause lung damage, bone marrow damage, things like that. And it's not a common clinical thing. There aren't a ton of places that do it. But our endocrinologists had been ramping up their program, and they're like, we want to still be able to do this. And so the question is, okay, well, who's going to provide that clinical service on the physics side of things? And our nuke med manager at the time is like, well, I'll just do it. And I'm like, I'm fairly new myself, and I'm like, okay, well, what do we do? What's the most appropriate thing to do? Now, I don't know if this was the best idea or not. I had done some dosimetry as a resident in graduate school and whatever. I'd done some nuke med dosimetry. And I said, you know what, one of the places that does this and where I happen to train is MD Anderson. And so I called down there and I said, hey guys, can I come down there? A lot of diagnostic imaging physicists do. It's also a lot of debate about what training do you need to do to be able to do it. So we said, okay, well, we're going to break this down even further, just to complicate things more. We're going to talk about acceptance testing, annual testing, post-repair, and then continuous quality assurance. Where continuous quality assurance is things like maybe the morning daily QA that's typically done by a technologist or something like that. We're going to say, we're going to kind of talk about these 4 different things because what's most appropriate for who's doing the testing may vary based on kind of which of these things it falls into. There's a lot of discussion because people are saying, wait, you really should have a QMP doing all of your annual testing. And then there were a lot of us on the phone call saying, you know what, we actually see more problems after there's a repair, after there's been a tube replacement or something like that. That's when you usually see a problem. I will very often say that for a lot of the equipment testing for imaging stuff, a minimally trained monkey could do most of it. And I stand by that, but where a QMP is valuable is that minimally trained monkey is not going to recognize all the time when there's something wrong. And sometimes it's just having set foot in the clinic, it's looking at it and say, you know what, this isn't something that maybe I usually quantify when I do the testing, but it looks off. And that's where I think a lot of the value is. So the question is, how do we do things that are going to be efficient? Because I don't think it's practical to say you have to have a QMP, somebody who's very highly educated and qualified, doing every medical physics related task, partly because I don't want to have to do it, but partly because I don't think it's practical. But the question is, when is this important? How do we provide good patient care? And make sure that we're catching stuff that really a QMP is going to be much more likely to catch, that may get overlooked if you have somebody who's just kind of going through the routine testing and tracking numbers. Okay, so we talked about that. So, again, we start out with performs, and they came up with a EPE, equipment performance evaluation. I don't know that that's used anywhere else. If it is, I'm not aware of it. So let's talk about primary interpretation displays for radiology. Of course, excluding mammography, because that has their own regulations. They misspelled post-repair here, and I don't know if it's supposed to be hyphenated or not, but apparently it's, I don't know, I guess you should say POS repair, which is a different issue. I don't know like that. It's supposed to be post-repair. And so this is the sort of thing, it's like, hey, you should probably have that overseen by a QMP. And this is particularly relevant because in the state of Colorado, one of the suggested, there are revisions that are underway for some of the Colorado regulations. One of the things that's in there is that every single diagnostic display has to be tested on an annual basis by a QMP. And I read that and I'm like, I don't want to do that. And I don't think it's necessary. And that's really, I joke that I don't want to do it, but really the more important thing is, if you think about how many radiologist displays are being used in the state of Colorado, it's a lot. Some of them are in people's homes and, home offices. I don't know, I don't know if people in Colorado have that many boats. And their ski lodges. And so the question is, are we adding value by saying that that task can only be done by a human being? Now, I will be totally straightforward that there's the other side of things too, where some people are like, hey, we need this document for job protection. We don't want those medical physics extenders coming and stealing all our jobs. Maybe I'm naive. That's not my own personal viewpoint. I think that there are folks who are concerned a little bit about that, and I'm not saying that that's wrong or anything. And like I said, maybe I'm just naive. That's not my main concern, but again, it's thinking about, okay, well, what's going to be best for patient care and what's practical? If you think, okay, well now we've got to pay the state of Colorado healthcare system or whatever, healthcare group has to pay a QMP to test every single diagnostic display in the state of Colorado every single year. That's millions of dollars that the healthcare system is now spending on this, and if we added any benefit to patient care. So that's kind of where some of this, I have no idea when I started. I'm sorry. So I'm going to go through the rest of this and show you the slides so that you can't see anything. But you can kind of see, again, it goes through by modality for all of the, here's my summary. Okay, so intent to define the practice of clinical medical physics, intended to define the recommended practice, not the minimum practice. So again, this is sort of, the idea is that this is APM, statement on what should be done, not sort of this minimally competent thing. Compromises were made, imperfections exist, and you have a chance to give input within the next 5 years or less. So I would encourage you, and I may or may not be on the committee that reviews this in 10 years, who knows, or 5 years. 5 years is a long time away. But I would encourage you to peruse it if you have any interest at all, and give input. Contact Jessica Clements and say, hey, I agree with this, you guys are totally off base with that or whatever. I found this really useful, this is garbage, whatever it may be. I usually try to say, don't submit stuff like you're a stupid jerk face. But, if you have comments though, because again, this is supposed to be a product from the organization, and if there are things where they miss the mark, then, we want to be able to kind of have that reflected with most people's clinical practices. So, that's all I have.